Hey everybody, welcome to week 6 of History 132 Blended. This week we are talking about the color line. Again, more on Jim Crow and racial segregation. And then we are also going to be talking about the progressives and the progressive movement. Remember this week also that in lieu of an online attendance quiz, you will be doing a rough draft workshop on Blackboard. You'll be in groups of 3, and you will upload your paper, attach it in a discussion board in your group, however you want to do it. You could do a file exchange or a discussion board. You will read your 2 classmates' papers and offer comprehensive comments and critiques to each classmate. I'll be checking those to make sure that people are following through on that, and that will be your online attendance for this week. So, organized racist riots like that in Wilmington, which I discussed last week, were relatively rare. Far more common was the institution of lynching, and you're going to hear me repeat a couple of things with a bit more information. Lynching was murder conducted by a mob. One historian reports almost 2,500 lynchings between 1885 and 1900. Between 1900 and 1920, a Chicago newspaper reported that about 75 African American men were lynched in the South each year. Far more may have died, and lynching was an act of political terror that affected far more people than simply the victims. It was mostly in the South, mostly of black men, and there were some lynchings in the North and West parts of the United States of whites, Indians, and Asians, but they were the minority. Now, I cannot stress enough that lynching was an act of political terror. It was a public statement and a warning, and it drew huge crowds. Note the crowd in the photo. Note the smiles on the faces. Lynching was not an act of vengeance. Most crimes had flimsy or no evidence, which is why they never made it to trial, but rather it was a warning to black people. Most victims were young men or people who broke informal rules of segregation by complaining about wages, voting, etc. And it used to be, right? Like in the very late 19th and early 20th century, it was a very public thing. So we saw the response of resilience. We saw the farewell address of Congressman George White. Last week, we saw the response of flight. But there was the other response of accommodation. So W.E.B. Du Bois, who lived from 1868 to 1963, was a great African American intellectual. Writing in 1903, Du Bois wrote, quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. The relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America." Born in Massachusetts after the Civil War, he studied with the foremost social thinkers of his era at Fisk, Harvard, and the University of Berlin. Du Bois was a historian and a sociologist, and he rejected Booker T. Washington's strategy of accommodation to segregation and an emphasis on industrial work. Instead, he believed that African Americans were beautiful in their own right and should demand full and political equality with whites. Essentially, he takes a middle-class perspective because he's middle class. Contrast to Washington, right? So he's the founding officer of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. He lobbied and sued to defend black voting and other forms of social and political equality. NAACP-funded lawyers would bring hundreds of lawsuits against segregation for over 50 years, eventually winning key cases in the 1950s, which we will eventually get to that. Some adopt Du Bois's strategy. They help to maintain the pride and pretensions of a black elite in New York by engaging in many of the same behaviors that white people of their class do. This strategy took generations, and it constantly reminded people of their second-class status, and this hurt in many ways. So they want to be accommodated, they want to come into society, right? Washington's strategy was accommodation to segregation. Du Bois' strategy was we need to be accommodated as equal members of society. So accommodation in two different ways. The other strategy was separation. Other middle class African Americans imagined a different path, like Marcus Garvey. Garvey, a Caribbean immigrant, sought to unify all Africans. Marcus Garvey immigrated to New York City from Jamaica in 1916 at the age of 29. And if you listen to reggae, you've heard of him. He's a household name in Jamaica. Garvey was one of the new black immigrants from the Caribbean, and he came into Northern City, like many folks did at this time. He was one of many economic migrants, and they became an important subset of the northern urban African American population. These folks had no ties to the rural South or to the slavery heritage of the U.S. So these immigrants had never lived with legal segregation or in a climate of violent repression. There's no KKK in Jamaica, right? They tended to be middle class or economically independent and relatively well off in Jamaica. Garvey saw African Americans as part of a much larger global community of Africans. And Garvey concluded that growing black communities in northern cities could provide wealth and energy to solve two great problems of the era: imperialism in Africa and discrimination in the U.S. And note how positive and affirming these ideas were, right? The black communities can come together and solve these problems. He combined economic self-sufficiency ideas of Booker T. Washington with the idea of Pan-Africanism, that is, uniting with all African-descended people worldwide in a mass movement. He sought to overcome class and national divisions within African diaspora. So Garvey raised subscriptions for black-owned businesses. He ran a newspaper sold on 3 continents. He started a black-owned manufacturing corporation and started the Black Star shipping lines in 1919 to help aid migration back to Africa. Ultimately, Marcus Garvey was frustrated. Garvey was a very bad bookkeeper, and most of his ambitious projects failed. He was indicted for mail fraud in 1923. He was jailed in 1925. He was deported to Jamaica in 1927, and he died in London in 1940. So, do you accommodate or do you separate? There are 2 strategies with no exit. Ultimately, accommodation and separation share a great deal in common. Both are strategies taken by black people to defend themselves. Neither brings real freedom, but both offer an oppressed minority tools to defend themselves. The 2 strategies will repeat throughout the 20th century: integrate or separate, right? Like Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, same kind of ideas. Black nationalism or civil rights within the United States. So black migrants begin one of the greatest peaceful migrations of human beings in world history. There are extraordinary consequences of the change from rural southern people, and hundreds of years as basically serfs, to urban northern people. The Democratic Party will change, beginning with the New Deal coalition. There will be replacement for European immigrants in northern factories. There will be new kinds of racial tension, and there will be a deep and vibrant cultural influence in music, dance, dress, and language. Now we're going to switch gears and talk a little bit about the progressive movement in this end of part 1 of the video, and then we'll finish the progressive movement in part 2. So remember that a lot of urban middle class reformers during this period, including Jacob Riis, sought to reform industrial America rather than replace it. They looked forward. They were progressives. And progressivism established much of our current framework for political and social relations, while also being very different from our current times. So I like this slide because it gives just a comprehensive list of the things, and I'm going to list them here. Progressives gave us such modern institutions and arrangements as votes for women through the 19th Amendment, the war on drugs through the 18th Amendment, the direct election of senators through the 17th Amendment, graduated income tax through the 16th Amendment, central banking through the Federal Reserve Act, the National Park Service, consumer protection through the Food and Drug Act, birth control, investigative journalism, eugenics, conservation of natural resources, and college athletics. As this diverse list makes clear, and it's not all positive, right? It was a wide-ranging response to the social order and inequality unleashed by industrial capitalism, immigration, and urbanization. It was born of crisis, of the failure of tradition. And I will talk more about eugenics in the next part of the video. For those of you who are not familiar, that is the big blotch on this list of otherwise okay stuff. So progressives sought to update American institutions to catch up to the changes in American society. They pointed out that the Constitution was 125 years out of date. The Constitution barred women from voting. Blacks appeared in the Constitution only as slaves, and most white men could not vote. It was designed to rein in the popular uprisings of a revolt against Britain, to keep a rebellion from becoming a revolution. Thus, of the three branches of government, the President, who was appointed through the Electoral College, the Senate, who was appointed through state legislatures, and the Supreme Court, who were appointed as well, the people only directly elected one half of one branch, and that is the House of Representatives. Most of all, the 1789 Constitution designed a government for a nation of 4 million farmers in 13 coastal states living in a world without factories or cities or railroads or immigrants. It had to be updated for a nation of 100 million people in 48 states from the Pacific to the Atlantic, and that's as of 1912. So in the next part of the video, we're going to talk about when progressivism was, who was progressives, kind of what they did, how they went about stuff, their process, and we'll have a case study kind of explaining all of that when we talk about the birth control movement in the next part of the video.